In the heart of a high-security prison, where every moment can escalate into chaos, one inmate made a decision that would have consequences far beyond what he imagined. Thinking it was a harmless prank, he threw a cup of coffee at a prison guard. But what he didn't expect was the intense reaction that would follow. This video explores how a seemingly trivial act quickly spirals into an unforgettable lesson for both the inmate and the guard. The cafeteria was a place where time seemed to move slower, each tick of the clock dragging on in the same predictable rhythm. The hum of voices blended with the clatter of metal trays against the table, punctuated only by the sharp, mechanical noises of the guards moving about. Officer Thompson, only a year into his job, made his way down the aisle between the rows of prison tables, his eyes scanning for trouble as he moved with purpose. His uniform was neat and pressed, a reflection of his desire to maintain a level of order amidst the chaos of the prison. He wasn't exactly a veteran in the field, and the other guards knew it. His hands occasionally shook when he adjusted his cuffs or clipped his radio back onto his belt, betraying the unease he felt. Every step he took through the cafeteria was calculated, his mind ever alert for any signs of tension. He had learned quickly that a misstep in here could cost him his credibility, if not worse. He tried to appear calm and composed, but the weight of authority on his shoulders always left him slightly tense. He passed a few inmates who were talking quietly, keeping their heads low to avoid making direct eye contact. But then, his gaze fell on a familiar face. The inmate at table 23 was someone who had been on his radar for days. Tall, stocky, and undeniably aggressive, with a swagger that had been impossible to ignore. This was Jordan Blackwell, a man known around the facility for his violent outbursts and sharp temper. His dark hair was shaved close to his scalp, and his broad shoulders filled the chair as he sat alone, staring at Officer Thompson with an unsettling grin. Thompson's heart rate quickened as their eyes met. It was the kind of gaze that made you second-guess every move you made. Blackwell wasn't known for subtlety, and he didn't waste time hiding his intentions. As Thompson walked past, Blackwell's eyes never left him, the smirk growing wider, almost as if he was sizing up the young guard, waiting for the right moment to strike. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. He kept walking, but couldn't help the knot that formed in his stomach. Blackwell wasn't just any inmate. He had a reputation, one that was built on constant trouble, minor altercations with other inmates, and a history of making life difficult for the guards. Thompson had learned quickly that Blackwell was never one to back down from a challenge, and it was clear that today he was looking for a confrontation. As Officer Thompson continued his rounds, he tried to push the feeling out of his mind. There were others to watch, other threats to consider, but Blackwell's eyes stayed with him. It was like the prison walls themselves had shrunk in size, as if the tension between them was amplifying with every step Thompson took. He couldn't escape the unsettling sense that Blackwell was planning something, but what? Thompson was nearing the end of his round when he heard the scraping of a chair behind him. Before he could react, the sound of the inmate's voice broke the brief silence of the room. "Hey, guard!" Blackwell called, his tone mocking but with a certain sharpness to it. Thompson didn't turn around immediately. He knew better than to engage with an inmate who was looking to provoke a response, but the voice came again, louder now. "You ever get tired of being a little puppet?" Thompson finally stopped and turned. Blackwell was leaning back in his chair, his arms folded across his chest, that same knowing grin plastered across his face. There was a cocky glint in his eyes, as though he was daring Thompson to make a move. The air in the cafeteria seemed to grow heavier as the two men locked eyes. It was a standoff, each trying to measure the other, sizing up their weaknesses and strengths. Thompson knew Blackwell was testing him, trying to see how far he could push before the guard snapped. He took a deep breath and ignored the taunt. "Is there a problem, Blackwell?" he asked, his voice steady, but his heart raced in his chest. But Blackwell wasn't done yet. He reached down to the table, grabbed his cup of coffee, and without any warning, hurled it across the space between them. The brown liquid splashed across Thompson's uniform and face in a violent, sizzling arc, the heat searing the officer's skin. For a split second, time seemed to stop. Thompson's breath caught in his throat, and his hands froze, trying to process what had just happened. The room fell silent. Blackwell's face, still wearing that smirk, softened for just a moment. His eyes flickered with confusion. Had he overestimated the situation? Was this just part of his usual antics, a harmless prank in the chaos of the prison? Thompson stood there, stunned, his hand slowly reaching up to wipe the hot coffee from his face. He wasn't sure if the burn on his cheek or the shock of the moment was more intense. His shirt was soaked, and the smell of the coffee was sharp in his nostrils. For a brief moment, he considered laughing it off, maybe even treating it as a joke. But as his eyes locked onto Blackwell's, the reality of the situation hit him. This wasn't a prank. This was an assault, and it was a challenge. Blackwell hadn't realized the full extent of his mistake yet. The look on his face was one of curiosity now, not realizing that his small act of rebellion had just crossed a line. In his mind, this was just a game, a bit of humor in the bleakness of prison life. The guards had always been the ones in control, the ones who gave orders and enforced the rules. But here, he was just having fun. Maybe this time he'd gotten one over on the system, but the guard standing before him wasn't laughing. His expression hardened, and the way Thompson stood, still, steady, and unblinking, made it clear this was not something he was going to ignore. Thompson took a deep breath, feeling the heat of the coffee soaking into his clothes, the adrenaline surging through his veins. This was no longer just a joke. This was a test of authority, and Blackwell had just made a dangerous move. The prank that Blackwell thought was a harmless way to spice up the monotonous routine of prison life had just set off a chain of events he wasn't prepared for. The shift in the air was palpable now. Thompson wasn't just a guard. He was an officer and sworn to uphold the law, and no amount of humor or cocky grins would change that. The smirk on Blackwell's face began to fade as he started to realize the gravity of his action. For a moment, he seemed unsure of what to do next. Did he laugh it off and walk away? Did he apologize and hope for leniency? But before he could make another move, Thompson had already taken the radio from his belt, his fingers moving with swift precision as he called in for backup. The cafeteria, still eerily quiet, now held its collective breath. The rest of the inmates watched with keen interest. Some of them saw this as just another spectacle to entertain themselves with, but others recognized the change in the air. Something more serious was unfolding, and they were witnessing it firsthand. Blackwell's smirk disappeared entirely now, replaced by an expression that was much harder to read. Was it fear? Regret? Or just confusion at the way his joke had backfired? The moment the coffee splashed across Officer Thompson's uniform, everything changed. For a second, it felt as though the world had frozen in place. Blackwell's eyes, still wide with the excitement of what he thought was a harmless joke, slowly began to lose their cocky edge. He wasn't prepared for the look that crossed Thompson's face, a mix of disbelief and unspoken anger. The hot liquid dripped down Thompson's uniform, leaving stains that now marked him not just physically but mentally too. It wasn't just the coffee. It was a test of authority, a challenge to the power dynamic they had both come to understand in this harsh environment. And for a moment, Blackwell had no idea just how badly he had miscalculated. The inmates around them fell into an unnatural silence. The usual banter and laughter quieted down as they watched the scene unfold. Most of them had witnessed fights, altercations, and countless minor rebellions. But this felt different. This wasn't a random scuffle between two inmates or a minor slip-up in a routine. This was a clear challenge to the order that governed this place, and it was happening in front of them. Blackwell's grin began to falter, and in its place, a flicker of confusion crept into his expression. The initial rush of adrenaline from his actions started to drain away, and with it, the reality of what he had just done hit him like a cold slap. He had expected a laugh, maybe a few words of reprimand at worst, but the reaction from Officer Thompson was far from what he had anticipated. There was no chuckle, no calm dismissal of the situation. Instead, Thompson stood there, rigid, his eyes narrowing with growing intensity. The guard hadn't flinched. His expression was cold, calculating, as though he was already processing the consequences of the action in real time. It was in that moment that Blackwell realized something important. This wasn't just a joke. This wasn't just about a cup of coffee or a harmless prank. This was a matter of control. And for the first time, the inmate understood that the guard wasn't going to let this slide. The power dynamic had shifted in a way that Blackwell wasn't prepared for. As Thompson wiped the hot liquid from his face, his movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, and Blackwell could feel the shift in the air. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes. The other inmates were watching closely, their attention fully absorbed by the unfolding drama. They were silent not out of fear, but out of an unspoken understanding that something had changed. Prison was a place where power was the ultimate currency. And today, that power had been challenged. The only question now was how far this was going to go. For a brief moment, Blackwell thought about brushing it off, maybe cracking a joke to ease the tension. He could say something about how it was just a prank, just a misunderstanding. But that idea was quickly shut down by the steely expression on Thompson's face. There was no room for humor in this situation. There was no way to backtrack now. Blackwell's challenge had been accepted, and it was far too late to take it back. The realization slowly dawned on him. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something bigger. This was about respect. It was about authority. Something Blackwell had always fought against, always tried to undermine. And now, the very person he had tried to humiliate, Officer Thompson, was standing firm, unwavering in the face of what could easily turn into a volatile confrontation. The balance of power in the room was shifting, and Blackwell could feel it pulling away from him. His eyes flicked around the cafeteria, searching for any sign of support from his fellow inmates. But there was none. They were all watching him, waiting to see how this would play out. No one came to his defense. No one offered a word of encouragement. They were all silent, either curious to see what would happen or silently rooting for the guard to take control of the situation. Blackwell's bravado, the thing that had gotten him so far in this environment, now felt hollow. The confidence he once exuded now seemed more like arrogance. And with every second that ticked by, it became more and more evident that this was a battle he was no longer sure he could win. The guard didn't speak at first, allowing the silence to settle heavily between them. Thompson stood there, the wet fabric of his shirt clinging to him uncomfortably, his face still partially covered in the coffee, but his gaze never wavered. It was like he was waiting for Blackwell to make the first move, waiting for him to come to terms with what he had done. But Blackwell remained frozen for a moment, the full weight of the situation settling into his chest. He had thrown that cup of coffee thinking it would be a minor disruption, something to break the monotony of his prison existence. But now he could feel the tension, thick and palpable, creeping into every corner of the room. Finally, Thompson broke the silence, his voice low and controlled. "You think this is funny?" he asked, his tone colder than the air around them. The question hung in the air, and for the first time Blackwell felt the weight of his own actions. He had crossed a line, and he knew it now. The smirk on his face had long disappeared, replaced by something he rarely showed, vulnerability. Thompson's eyes narrowed even further, and his next words hit Blackwell like a punch to the gut. "You will learn today that there are consequences, and I'm not going to let you get away with this." The finality in Thompson's voice left no room for negotiation. Blackwell had expected anger, maybe even a quick reprimand, but what he hadn't expected was the level of control Thompson was displaying. This wasn't just a guard retaliating against a minor annoyance. This was a man who understood the weight of his position, who knew exactly how to handle the power he wielded, and it wasn't about to slip from his grasp. As the words sank in, Blackwell's mind raced. He could feel the eyes of the other inmates on him now, their gaze shifting between him and Thompson. There was no backing out, no clever remark he could make to smooth over the situation. This was no longer a prank. This was a test of authority, and Blackwell had just found himself on the losing side of it. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came. His usual bravado, the sharp retorts he would normally throw at anyone who dared challenge him, suddenly felt useless. He wasn't sure what to say anymore. The usual defiance that ran through his veins now felt weak, hollow. And as Thompson took a step closer, the reality of the consequences began to sink in. There was no escaping the gravity of his actions now. Blackwell had always prided himself on his ability to control his surroundings, to intimidate those around him and bend them to his will. But now, standing in front of Officer Thompson, he felt small, out of place. He realized far too late that there were some things in this world that couldn't be joked about. There were lines that should never be crossed, and the cup of coffee he had thrown had just opened up a whole new world of consequences he was not prepared to face. The humiliation, the realization of his mistake, set in hard as he finally saw the situation for what it was. He wasn't just in trouble. He was about to learn just how far his actions would take him into the depths of the system he thought he could defy. The tension in the cafeteria had reached a boiling point. Blackwell stood there, frozen, his mind racing but his body unable to move, caught between the heavy weight of realization and the harsh reality that the situation was spiraling out of his control. The rest of the inmates were watching with rapt attention, their eyes flickering between the two of them. Some of them seemed to relish in the spectacle, while others looked on with a hint of nervousness, knowing that the balance of power in the room was shifting in ways they couldn't quite predict. No one had seen this coming. Not the guard, not Blackwell, and certainly not the other prisoners. Officer Thompson's silence was as intimidating as his earlier words. Every second stretched longer, the space between them filled with a thick, suffocating quiet that seemed to amplify every heartbeat, every breath. Blackwell's skin crawled as he realized he wasn't going to be let off the hook with a simple reprimand or a quick threat. No, this wasn't about that anymore. This was about making an example of him, about restoring order to the chaos he had dared to disrupt. Thompson took a slow step toward him, the noise of his boots against the tiled floor cutting through the silence like a sharp knife. The sound felt heavy, deliberate, and Blackwell could feel his heart rate spike with each step. He had expected anger, but the officer's movements were controlled, almost methodical, as though this were just another day on the job. The guard's presence was overwhelming, an embodiment of authority that Blackwell had just realized he had underestimated. His usual bravado crumbled further as he saw the cold, steely determination in Thompson's eyes. The officer wasn't just going to let this go, he was going to make sure Blackwell understood the consequences of his actions. The air between them grew thicker with every passing second. Blackwell opened his mouth, trying to say something, anything, but the words stuck in his throat. He had always been quick with his tongue, always able to talk his way out of any situation, but this moment felt different. His usual sharp remarks and cutting insults felt insignificant, useless in the face of the relentless pressure from Thompson. His confidence, so often his shield in this prison environment, seemed to evaporate as the officer stood before him, the quiet and imposing force of his presence swallowing up any hope Blackwell had of easing the tension. Thompson's voice broke the silence again, this time with a quiet intensity that sent a chill down Blackwell's spine. "You thought this was a joke, didn't you?" The words weren't an accusation, they were a statement. Thompson was not asking for an explanation. He already knew the answer. Blackwell's mind churned, trying to find a way to regain control of the situation. He was used to being the one who held the power, who made the others bend to his will. But now, with Thompson standing in front of him, he was no longer the one in control. The guard's calmness, his quiet authority, felt like a slap in the face to Blackwell's arrogance. There was no outburst, no dramatic response. Thompson was in control of his emotions, his actions. And that in itself was more terrifying than anything Blackwell had ever encountered in this place. The quiet around them seemed to grow heavier, almost suffocating. Blackwell's mind raced as he searched for a way to diffuse the situation. Maybe he could apologize. Maybe he could somehow make light of what had happened. But as he glanced at the other prisoners, he realized that the moment had passed. There was no going back now. The inmates were watching closely, their expressions ranging from curiosity to thinly veiled amusement. They were all waiting for what would come next, some likely wondering how this would play out, while others, the ones who understood the consequences of challenging authority in this place, were likely already preparing themselves for the fallout. Thompson's gaze never wavered. He wasn't going to let Blackwell off with a simple apology or a few words of regret. This was not about forgiveness. This was about respect. Respect for the rules, respect for the authority of the officers, and respect for the balance of power in this place. Blackwell had broken that balance, and now he had to face the repercussions. "You think you can just do whatever you want here?" Thompson's voice was still calm, but the weight behind his words was undeniable. "You think this is some kind of playground for you to act out in?" The officer took another step closer, and Blackwell could feel the heat from his presence, the pressure mounting as the distance between them closed. He felt the need to shrink, to back away, but his legs refused to move. There was no escape. Blackwell's mind was spinning, trying to formulate a response. But his usual defenses were failing him. He had been so used to being in control, so accustomed to using his quick wit and sharp words to navigate the harsh world of the prison. But now, in the face of Officer Thompson's calm and unyielding stance, he felt exposed. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't the one with the upper hand. His bravado had crumbled, and in its place was an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. Thompson's eyes remained locked on Blackwell, unblinking. The silence stretched out again, but this time it wasn't a momentary pause. It was the kind of silence that only came when a decision was about to be made, a decision that would have consequences. The officer reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys, his movements slow and deliberate. Blackwell's eyes flicked to the keys, his pulse quickening as the realization hit him. He wasn't just going to get a slap on the wrist for this. Thompson wasn't going to let him walk away from this. He was going to make sure Blackwell paid the price for his challenge. The guard wasn't just responding to the coffee being thrown. He was sending a message to Blackwell and to everyone else in the room that there were lines that couldn't be crossed, and that anyone who tried to break them would face the full force of the consequences. Blackwell's stomach twisted as he saw Thompson's fingers tighten around the keys. The officer was preparing to take him out of the cafeteria, out of the public eye, where the consequences would be far more severe. Blackwell's heart pounded in his chest, but there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had made a mistake, and now he was about to learn just how far that mistake could go. As Thompson turned and started to walk toward the exit, Blackwell's mind raced with the implications of what was happening. He could feel the eyes of the inmates on him, some with expressions of pity, others with a strange sense of satisfaction. It didn't matter now. What mattered was the lesson Thompson was about to teach him. Blackwell had thought he was invincible, that he could act without consequences, but now, as the guard walked away, he understood something important. In this place, no one was untouchable. Everyone had their limits, and it seemed that Blackwell had just found his. The walk down the corridor felt longer than it should have. Each step echoed against the cold, hard concrete walls, the distant murmur of other inmates fading into a haunting silence as Blackwell was led further away from the cafeteria. His hands clenched into tight fists at his sides, his mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. He had been in trouble before, had faced discipline, but this felt different. There was an air of finality to it, as if some invisible line had been crossed, and there would be no way to simply talk his way out of this one. Officer Thompson walked ahead of him, his back straight, his boots hitting the ground with a steady, unrelenting rhythm. He never looked back, never slowed down, never gave Blackwell so much as a glance. It was as if he had already decided how this was going to end, and there was no point in acknowledging the prisoner behind him until it was time to deal with him properly. Blackwell swallowed hard. His throat was dry. He could still feel the lingering heat of the coffee that had splashed onto his own hands during the scuffle. At the time, it had seemed funny, just another way to assert himself in an environment where dominance was currency. He had thought it would earn him respect, make him seem untouchable in the eyes of the other inmates. But now, as he was being marched down the dimly lit corridor toward whatever punishment awaited him, he realized how foolish he had been. Respect wasn't something you could take by force. Not here. And definitely not from a man like Thompson. They turned a corner, and Blackwell's stomach clenched when he saw where they were headed. The solitary confinement cells, the SHU, the hole. A cold sweat broke out across his skin. He had never spent time in the hole before, not really. He'd heard the stories, though, inmates going in and coming out broken, some losing their sense of time, their grip on reality. It wasn't just about the isolation, it was about the powerlessness, the absolute stripping away of anything that made a man feel human. The hole had a way of reminding people of exactly where they stood in the prison hierarchy. It was the one place where no amount of reputation, no amount of bravado could save you. Thompson stopped at a heavy steel door. He produced a key from his belt and inserted it into the lock. The click of the mechanism disengaging sent a spike of dread through Blackwell's chest. "Inside," Thompson said, his voice calm, controlled. Blackwell hesitated. His pride fought against the urge to comply. As he looked into the darkness of the tiny windowless room, he realized he had no choice. There was no bargaining here, no clever retort that would get him out of this. He had pushed too far, and now he had to face the consequences. Slowly, he stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the scent of sweat and something else. Something older. Something that smelled like despair. The walls were bare. The cot against the far wall, nothing more than a thin mattress on a slab of concrete. A small, rust-stained sink and toilet sat in the corner, the only other features in the room. Thompson stepped inside after him. Blackwell tensed, unsure of what was coming next. The officer closed the door behind them but didn't lock it. Not yet. For a moment, the only sound was the faint buzz of the overhead fluorescent light. Then Thompson spoke. "You think you're the first tough guy to pull something like that?" His voice was low, steady. "You think I haven't seen your type 100 times before?" Blackwell didn't respond. He kept his gaze fixed on the floor, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. "You all make the same mistake," Thompson continued, stepping closer. "You think you can play by your own rules, you think you can test the limits and nothing will happen." His voice dropped lower, almost to a whisper. "But there's always a consequence. Always." Blackwell felt a cold weight settle in his gut. This wasn't just about a cup of coffee anymore. This was about control, about reminding him who really held the power here. Thompson took another step closer, his presence towering over Blackwell like a shadow that couldn't be escaped. "You wanted to be funny? To get a laugh out of your little friends?" His voice was almost mocking now. "Tell me, Blackwell, are you laughing now?" Blackwell's fists tightened at his sides. His instincts screamed at him to lash out, to say something, anything that would salvage his pride. But he knew better. He could feel the edge in Thompson's tone, the warning buried beneath every word. This was a lesson, and he was meant to learn it the hard way. Thompson exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Then, without another word, he stepped back and turned toward the door. He pulled it open but paused just before stepping out. "You'll be in here for a while," he said, casually, like he was discussing the weather. "Plenty of time to think about what kind of man you want to be." And then, without ceremony, the door swung shut. The sound of the lock sliding into place sent a final, chilling note through the air. Blackwell was alone. The silence pressed in on him immediately, thick and suffocating. He stood there, his breathing shallow, his mind still trying to process what had just happened. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the walls, the ceiling, the tiny, useless cot. This was it. This was where he would be, alone with his thoughts, alone with the weight of his choices. Minutes passed. Then hours. Time stretched and twisted, losing meaning in the confines of the cell. There was no sound except for the occasional shuffle of footsteps outside, distant and disconnected from him. He had never felt this small before, this insignificant. He had always thought of himself as someone who couldn't be broken. But now, as he sat down on the cot, his back against the cold, concrete wall, he felt the first stirrings of doubt creep into his mind. For the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as untouchable as he had once believed.